Okay, so this is topics. I'm going to talk about a few things here. The first thing I want to talk about is that whole thing I presented you before. It's too mixed up. You can't possibly understand what one inequality measure is doing in another. They're just so discordant. They don't link to one another. And so the structure that I'm presenting to you right now is the structure I presented last week at the keynote address at the World Bank. They're restructuring, thinking more about inequality and equity issues. And so this was the way that we've been talking about bringing the discussion forward at the bank. So now the issue is, how are all inequality measures alike? And by the way, it extends to all kinds of other measures. Okay? So that's what we'll be getting at here. Income standards. What's an income standard? Well, the whole idea is to try to get at what really inequality really means over groups, which I think is actually more important than over individuals for most situations, but also for populations of individuals. The problem is there's too many approaches, and they all seem to not match up to one another. You can't put them on the same page. What you need is a unifying framework, and that's what hopefully this will provide to capture both those kind of sophisticated relative inequality measures, Lorenz consistent things we talked about, and also crude measures that are extremely helpful in generating intuition about what's really happening. The 90/10s of the world. It's extremely important to get a sense, or the 1% of the world. So how do you see them as one? One thing, just different shades. Okay? So an income standard summarizes the entire distribution in one number. Okay, that's all it is. It's taking the whole distribution, and I'm going to give it one number. It's like the mean, the median, the income of the 90th percentile, the mean of the top 40th percentile. Sen's mean, Atkinson's EDEs. It measures the size of the distribution, as we've talked about previously. And it can have normative implications, like Atkinson's EDE does. But it turns out that inequality is just basically a discussion of two standards. So the main thing I want to explain to you here is that every inequality measure that I know, and that any that I've seen used, is either a ratio of two standards or a limit of that. So the idea is twin income standards. You have one income standard that looks at an income distribution through the right eye, emphasizing higher incomes. And you look at another income standard that emphasizes the lower incomes through your left eye. And then at the end of the day, what we wind up doing is comparing the two standards to one another. If they spread apart, inequality is higher. If they come together, it's lower. That's what inequality is all about. Okay, so applications, I'll talk about growth and inequality, opportunity inequality, and poverty inequality. All of this comes from papers that, unfortunately, I didn't put on the site. Some of them are there, some of them are not. The newest one is this analysis of poverty and inequality with people at the bank. We're trying to organize the way that poverty and inequality are being looked at through this particular lens. Reflections on Human Opportunity Index. The bank has an index that's based on kind of Romer's approach to inequality of opportunity. It's an index of size, and this is a paper describing that index in terms of standards and relating it to the multidimensional poverty index, which is something that's come across recently I'll tell you about later. Inequality measurement in the Elgar Companion gives all the intuition that I'll be presenting today. The poverty measurement paper also does it for poverty measures. So the next one does it for poverty measurement. And the next two papers are highly theoretical axiomatic structures, deriving classes of measures that are quite interesting. But the intuition of those two papers is where everything came from. The fact that we had, for the measures that we found there, twin income standards, then allowed us to generalize it to all possible inequality measures. And finally, of course, the summary of Sen's in my annex of the book. Forgive the box, it means union, but that happens sometimes. So this is the notation. We have incomes, we have population size, set of all earned incomes, in-person income distributions, set of all income distributions is given by D. We use a cumulative distribution for illustrative purposes, but usually look at discrete case. Here's the picture you saw before, focusing now on size. Focusing now on size. Now, I gave a talk at Wider many years ago. Angus Deaton gave the address, the main address, and then I followed up with some discussion. And my point there was that if we're trying to get beyond sort of very simple measures of health, in this case it was a discussion of health inequality in health, the only way we're going to do it is by having some way of capturing populations, the distribution over population in a simple way, and this was potentially a way of doing it. And in fact, the Human Development Index essentially does this. It's based on some kind of an indicator, in fact, a mean across all people of a health indicator going from 0 to 1. It's very simplistic. I don't mean to say that that's the answer to the world. I'm just saying that's an example of it. But much more could be done. In particular, I was trying to address the issue that many times health data are ordinal. And how do you deal with ordinal data when you're trying to talk about inequality? It's a big problem. So this might be an approach, although I'll have to explain it to you later exactly how it might be applied. So income standards, what do they mean? Here's what they mean. Here are the properties defining these animals. 1, symmetry, we know that from before. Replication and variance, know it from before. Linear homogeneity, that's different. That means if you double all these incomes, I'm going to look at income standards, but it could be standards applied to consumption, it could be applied to anything, I'll just call it income to make it simple. Linear homogeneity, double all incomes, then of course the standard must double. Normalization, if everyone has the same income, then that's the standard. Continuity, just make sure it's smooth enough. Weak monotonicity, if one person's income rises, the standard shouldn't fall. You could make that strict, I'm not, because of the median, for instance. Okay, all of these properties are satisfied by all the examples that we talked about previously and that I'll be addressing right now. This is easy, relax, enjoy yourself. I'm going to go through a bunch of examples. Here's the mean. Yes, you have 2 incomes. All of those have the same mean as we talked about before. Okay, there's the picture of the mean also. It's the area to the left of the distribution. How many had seen that before? Weird, isn't it? It's so easy. Okay, there's the median. Everyone knows that. There's the income at the 10th percentile. Okay, how about the mean of the bottom 5th? The mean of the bottom 5th was part of a series of papers started by Art Cray, David Dollar. It was, is growth good for the poor? And they used this as their indicator of the poor, the mean of the bottom 20th percentile. Bottom 20th, bottom 5th. And it's interesting because this has all sorts of weird properties. As I'll show you later, it's not subgroup consistent. Of course it isn't. Okay. In any case, this is a great mean. It's a great income standard. Let's continue. The mean of the top 40%. That's another income standard. All incomes double. This will double, et cetera, et cetera. All properties satisfied. You know that one. That little box there is supposed to be a mu, but sometimes my fonts turn into boxes just to spite me, and I've been spited. So S of x, the Sen measure of welfare, is the mean of that matrix. We saw that before, which is 30/16, and that's less than the mean of 1, 2, 3, 4, which is 40/16, because we're doing the min situation, right? Okay, so that's another income standard that could be very useful. All right, continuing. The Sen mean, or welfare function, has a neat picture attached to it. Here it is. Take P. Look at that area. Map over there A against P. Graph, turn your head, graph the generalized Lorenz. If you see where it hits up on the top here, that's going to be the mean. Divide by the mean, it meets at 1, Lorenz. Bring it back out, generalized Lorenz. Okay, let's turn it over this way, and it so happens that the area below this generalized Lorenz curve times 2 is the Sen welfare measure. It's kind of nice, because now you see if the generalized Lorenz curve goes up, then this welfare function is naturally going up as an area below it. Just like Gini, you have this nice picture to represent what it's measuring. Atkinson's geometric mean, for instance. The geometric mean has the usual shaped indifference curve, right? And where it cuts is the geometric mean. X, obviously the geometric mean is always below the arithmetic mean except when all incomes are equal. This, of course, emphasizes lower incomes. By multiplying everything together, guess what? If you have a 0 there, it's going to turn everything to 0, so that's an extreme case. Okay. Let's look at the Euclidean mean. This takes everything and squares it. Takes the average and then takes the square root. It's circle in terms of its indifference. X is here, the mean is higher because you're emphasizing the highest income by squaring it and then unsquaring. Okay, so that's the Euclidean mean. And here's the entire class of means. Mu alpha, that should be alpha. The box now stands for alpha on this slide. Thank you. If you have a Mac, you'll be able to see it perfectly. Sorry about that. So all alpha not equal to 0, that formula will apply. For alpha equals 0, hence the geometric mean, the bottom formula applies. This is a class that's been known forever and used by lots of people. Hardy, Littlewood, and Polya talks about it. Combe talked about it. Atkinson talked about it. All these different means are there. For alpha less than 1, it's distribution sensitive, which means that you emphasize the lower incomes, or put differently, if you have a transfer between a rich guy and a poor guy that makes incomes closer together, then this mean goes up. Okay. So what's inequality? All the stuff I talked to you about before were examples. Now we want to try and bring it together in one very simple framework. There are 2 dimensions for evaluation. I'm claiming it turns on twin income standards. So let's look at it in the simplest of all possible cases. I believe this was brought up yesterday. And so let's use it in that case. It's 2 persons, person 1 and 2, 2 incomes, x1 and x2. The minimum of those 2, whichever it is A, let's say. The max of those 2 is B. And inequality is naturally measured as B minus A over B, or over A, or over the average, or something. It's quite natural, right? Or generally, it's just a ratio of A over B. Okay, because the B is there, and so it's a function of this ratio. All right. So now let's look at groups. You have group-based inequality. You have 2 groups, group 1, group 2. 2 income distributions, x1, x2. The income standard, S of x, is going to be used on each of those distributions separately. The lower income standard, the one that has the lowest size according to the income standard, A, is equal to the min of those 2. The higher, B, is the max of those 2. And inequality could be measured as B minus A over B, or some function of the ratio A over B. Should look pretty similar to things you've thought of, right? So means men, women. Okay. This can be generalized not to just 2, but to any number of groups by using a smooth distribution. And that will be done later on, where you take all the groups and give them their mean and then apply an inequality measure. But we'll see that later. So group-based examples. I think group-based inequality is more interesting at the end of the day than most types of inequality. And I think that politically it certainly is more salient. Spatial disparities, they just loom before you when you think of the South and the North in the US in the early days. I guess it's still the same way. I used to teach in Nashville, Tennessee. So we got to see a lot of it up front, up top. Gender inequality, male, female, growth. Did anyone ever think of inequality? Growth is inequality. Deprivation has it in his book, so he was the one who informed me. But yeah, you have a mean over here. That's now. A mean over here. That's the next period. And you're seeing more inequality, hopefully, if you have growth. And that's a good thing. So is inequality good? Yeah, in that case. Unless it's like this recently, and then inequality becomes worse. Okay. So growth has a link to inequality very naturally in that case. Another example is racial health disparities in the US, and I have this paper in Public Health Reports. Income standard has to do with 1 minus mortality rate. I'll just give you the graph because it's so much more fun. This is based on impossible data from 33 and back because it's just based on a few states, but after that it's based on lots of states. And this is age-adjusted mortality among blacks and whites. And what's interesting about this log scale is how constant things are, basically 50% higher for blacks than whites over the entire period. I mean, you can explain it away, right, with various things. I'm just saying this is fact. I'm looking at data. And another thing is that if you evaluate if you're black now, that's green, and then how far back you'd have to go to look like being black now. It's about 30 years, and that's held more or less constant over this time period. Very interesting sort of strong results. Also, excess deaths have been pretty constant over the time period because the growth in population has just about matched the decrease in mortality. And so it's been about 250, 300 people a day, excess deaths in blacks. Very interesting. These are the constants of black-white health inequality in US parts of them anyway.
What are some of the explanations for that persistence?
Looks like wealth inequality persistence as well, doesn't it? Looks like lots of things that are capital that is persisting. I don't know, David Williams knows what he thinks it is, but I don't want to venture guesses except the usual one, which is there's been an amazing transference of all kinds of things over generations that started with a very strong sense of deprivation early on. And it's been transmitted through cultural and individual means. I think a lot of it is, captured in the early years. Let's face it. That's why I'm hopeful that we can see some interesting non-cog analyses hit really in the mainstream and really start changing the way things are done in early education.
I mean, there are other measures where you can see convergence.
Sorry?
Other measures would get to convergence with the life expectancy.
Life expectancy can. That constructed measure certainly will. You showed the picture on the some convergence, right? And this is actually quite convergence. Log misleads you a bit. Yeah. It's not, this is relative inequality. And that's holding fixed. 50% higher. That's holding fixed. But absolutely, there's a hell of an improvement in health by everyone. It's just, it's always a lag. Fascinating. Okay. Other comments? Yes?
This could be a really dumb question. How does life expectancy converge when mortality rates are?
Well, this is, again, log. If you looked at it in just absolute mortality, you'd see a coming together as well. So you'd have a convergence in absolute yes.
Mortality.
Mm-hmm. Because everyone's getting a hell of a lot. But it's still 50% higher. That's what this is showing you. The constancy in log means same percentage. All right, so group-based. The groups can often be ordered. And consequently, you expect that women, men's wage have a certain order to them. Or men and women's health, the other way around. Poor region, rich region. Ethnic groups in different countries. In fact, in the case of Malaysia, this was the issue in the late 70s and early 80s. It was about ready to tear the country apart. And so that's why this became so salient at the time, to be able to do subgroup or group analyses and understand what was going on. It can reflect all kinds of permanent or persistent inequalities of very special concern. So the health of the poor versus the health of the non-poor, or the health of adjacent SES classes. So this is the standard gradient we've seen, where you have SES, could be occupation, the Whitehall study we mentioned before. It could be income, it could be education itself. All of those have gradient. One of the more interesting results that I've never published, but which was based on an approach that I have called external capabilities. It's essentially related to this paper I did with Kaushik Basu of measuring literacy. If you're in a household in India and you're illiterate, but you have someone living with you who can read, then guess what? You have access to some share of literacy skills, and therefore, in essence, you're in a better shape. Kaushik went ahead with Martin Ravalian and did a test which in Bangladesh, and saw that this had an effect on wages in Bangladesh. That if you were illiterate, but if you lived with someone who was literate, that impact could be seen in your labor market outcome according to their results. In our results, it was health, self-reported health in this case, but it could be other indicators. And this, of course, there's a standard gradient that you might see in your own education. But now let's look at your health as a function of the next, highest level of education. Or let's say you're a lowly educated person. Your health is a function of the higher educated person. Gradient's there. It's cross gradient for sure. And so there's interesting results that are going on in the household. Could be sorting. It could be all kinds of things. But for sure, it exists, and it would be interesting to discuss. Okay, relevance depends on the salience of groups, and I want to emphasize that the salience of them really is what gets things going. When you have discussions of black versus whites in US, it can be quite salient. In Malaysia, it was ethnic. It could be very salient. It can actually be more important than overall inequality. And that's really what I've concluded. The overall Gini discussion may not be as salient as looking at the two groups separately and talking about them. So let's go to the next stage, which is measuring inequality in a population. We were just there. Why am I going back to it? Here's why. So a wide array of measures. It's horrific. I get bored. I sleep whenever how can I present that? What do these measures have in common? All right, structure. Framework for population inequality. One income distribution. Now, two income standards. A lower income standard, SL. A higher income standard or upper income standard, SU. A refers to the lower, B refers to the higher. And I want to make sure that it's always that way. So I have this inequality, which should be a weak there, that the upper standard is always at least as high as the lower standard. Okay? And typically you want it to be such that they would be only equal at equality, but forget about it. Let's just say that this weak inequality holds. Then guess what? You measure inequality as B minus A over B, or some function of the ratio A over B. All of those measures we talked about before look like this. They're some function of this ratio. It omits two examples. One of them is the tile measure, and one of them is the variance of logs. But they're the same in limits. It's a slope, actually, and I'll show you the slope in just a second. All of them take the same form. Yes?
So these standards are like summary statistics of the
Yes, they are.
distribution. And then, so how should we think of, so basically inequality is always going to be less than right?
In this case, yes, but I'm just saying that's one function. The general function is to the right. It just tends to be a function of the ratio of these two. So a general function. And so, for instance, if you look at the log, the variance of logs, tile's second measure, it's the log of the arithmetic over the geometric mean. So it's got a log in there. It doesn't have this form. This form would be the equivalent measure by Atkinson. He has the average, the arithmetic mean, minus the geometric mean over the arithmetic mean. That's his version of the same measure. It's not decomposable, but it's more understandable. Okay? So that's the group. In fact, variance of logs in the limit has the same structure. So all those measures have the same structure. So,
We should think of standards as like different measures of inequality.
It's measures of size. You're looking at the distribution and focusing on some part of it or emphasizing one part more than the other. And by looking at that, what's being emphasized, you actually get a sense of what the inequality measure is measuring. In particular, you can forget about inequality for a moment, just post the two standards as they go through time. And that's what was done in some of the slides that you were showing. So the Gini coefficient, I just want to show you what the standards would be for the various measures. Gini coefficients, sen is the lower, the mean is the higher. Coefficient of variation, the mean is the lower, and the Euclidean mean is the higher. It's emphasizing the higher distributions, the higher incomes, I mean. Mean log deviation, the second tile measure. Geometric mean, mean. Generalized entropy, there's two parts to it. One part has a generalized entropy measure, a general mean for the lower one, and then the mean for the higher. And the second part of it has the mean for the lower and a general mean for the higher. It's kind of bifurcated, two different parts of it. One part is sensitive to the lower incomes, and one is sensitive to higher incomes. 90-10, that's straightforward. And all of those pairs of measures, 90-50, 50-10, it's all. Decile ratio, the mean in the top 10%, you could of course have the top 1% here, which is what Piketty and group have used essentially. So when he presented that work early on, I said, you know, you're measuring inequality. You have two standards. And it did. It worked out perfectly that to be in this structure. Atkinson family, mean, and then the general mean. So it's all there. This is what you have. Let me go through some examples to see why this is interesting, because it's nice to have a unifying framework. Everyone likes that. I'm a theorist. That's what I go after. But what does it do for us? We'll talk about it right now. So summary, first off, we have virtually every inequality measure has two dimensions, twin dimensions of income standards. The characteristics of the inequality measure depend on these underlying standards. You can reverse the process and take an inequality measure and construct welfare. You can look at it in terms of poverty, construct poverty measures. Because poverty measures, you have one standard already in the picture. It's the poverty line. So it's natural that you have one standard. And what's the other one? In the head count ratio, it isn't there, but for other ones, it's there. So let's have a look at a couple of more examples of how it goes back and forth. Here's the Gini coefficient expressed, and then the sen measure is expressed as a function of the Gini. So I can actually determine the sen measure based on most data out there. I have the mean, I have the Gini. I can pop up with the sen welfare measure. Atkinson's, same thing, goes back and forth. Where was this used recently? Recently, the Human Development Report decided it would not just release the Human Development Index, which is the average of three indicators, one for health, one for education, and one for living standards. Average. Each one inside is kind of an average. So it's an average of average, means of means. But they decided to follow some advice that Luis Felipe Lopez Calva, Miguel Seckley, and I had put in a paper in 2005 to consider looking at the distribution of each of these dimensions. Now, it's arguable whether the other two dimensions are cardinal, so I may be going a little bit off the edge, but allow me to assume that for the moment. I used a geometric mean within dimension and geometric mean across dimensions to obtain an inequality-adjusted Human Development Index. So it's been appearing in the Human Development Report since 2010. And the results have been really interesting because education, you wouldn't expect, would be the big drive. It hugely impacts. The inequality in education hugely impacts the resulting rankings and so on. So quite an interesting digging into the data to see what happens. Now, how did they implement it? Are you really going to be able to get information on all incomes in all countries across the world at the distribution level? Of course not. So what you can do is use this formula, and this is how we approximated it. We had estimates of the Atkinson measure, which had been done by different people in different countries. Maybe not consistent. I can't argue. But we use that along with the mean to reconstruct the geometric mean. And so that was the trick that we had to do because data are so bad. At least get an approximation. And we did so with really bad data in health and kind of bad data in education, and took a very big bite and said, it's all yours, Human Development Report Office. But the concept's good. One final example here of going back and forth that I think is really interesting. You certainly have been in classes where people said, well, the income distribution is very skewed. And they mean unequal. but they may mean unequal really. Because for most distributions, obviously the mean exceeds the median, at least the ones we tend to look at. So it kind of fulfills my requirement, doesn't it, on the income standards. And let's suppose we look at this measure of skewness, mean minus the median over the mean. That's a fine measure of skewness, isn't it? And we go back to deriving the median from the mean and the measure of skewness. It's the same structure, an inequality measure, right? Over the domain of, restricted domain of distributions that satisfy this inequality. Quite cool. So you can see that there's an intuitive sense in which skewness is indeed inequality, not just the kind of random way that we talk about it frequently. Okay. Subgroup consistent income standards. Oh yes, you're ready for this. It's a characterization. I'll be quick, don't worry. The theorem says as follows. This is the paper that I have online, that an income standard satisfies subgroup consistency if and only if it's a positive multiple of this class. Essentially the E to E functions or the broader class of general means. That's fascinating. I had no idea this was the case. So all these other indices, these other income standards actually can go up and up, but down over. Very strange. Nonetheless, let's continue, because this paper, in that paper, the Dollar and Cray discussion was given in the beginning of the paper, and essentially we were saying, look, is growth good for the poor? They had got this nice result that if incomes in average go up by 1%, then the poor incomes go up by 1%, they said. The problem was if you lowered from 20% down to about 10, the result goes away, et cetera, et cetera. There's a few other problems, but we did it in a different way. We had the mean going here, and then we had the general mean with a alpha that emphasized the poor incomes. And we saw how those two were related to one another in the elasticity, if you will, and got very fuzzy results and reported those fuzzy results, and other people took it as saying that there's no real discernible result as clear as what Dollar and Cray were saying. All right, so this class is important. Why do you think that we get the decomposability results? It's this. Because you have the mean for most of those other inequality measures, and what's left over is this other thing, and that has to be subgroup consistent. So it happens to be related to what Tony Shorrocks had done in his 1988 paper. This is a really cool graph. Now, why is it a really cool graph? It's because I can show you all the inequality measures, like in the generalized entropy class, on that graph. And it's just too weird. Well, okay, let's see the intuition. Oop, let's not see that intuition. Thank you. Let's see the intuition on that graph. Now, you've seen this graph before. And this graph is the quantile graph. And it says, well, 10%, okay, 10, 90. 90 versus 10. Kind of that slope divided by the distance maybe, but okay, 90, 10. Cool. 90 to 50 has to do with that slope of that segment. It's all in that graph for those kinds of measures. You can get it right off the graph here. Similarly, for generalized entropy, just as simply, here we have the mean, alpha equals 1. Compare that to the geometric mean. That slope of that segment has to do is 1-to-1 with the mean log deviation. So if you normalize by the mean so that two distributions have exactly the same mean, then all those slopes from the crossing point where all have the same mean, so it'll be a mean of 1, all those slopes will indicate inequality by the generalized entropy class. Likewise going up for the coefficient of variation squared and so on. What is the tile measure? The tile measure on this graph is the slope at the point 1. It's the limit, because you have all the generalized entropy coming closer and closer and closer in ratios, and then in the limit you get the slope. What about variance of logs? Slope. Two results all sitting in this graph. It's quite surprising and interesting. Okay. Application to growth. To see how inequality changes over time, guess what? Most inequality measures have the mean within them. So the mean is changing, that's growth. Look at the other mean or the other income standard. See how it's changing, how it grows. Compare the growth rates. You'll see what happens to inequality. Again, this is what has been done in some of the graphs that were presented. So calculate the growth rate for the one standard, for the other. Note, usually one of them is the mean. I just got through saying that. And compare. So I want to make the main statement here, growth of what really matters. So it's growth of these income standards, perhaps. But even when you go beyond this, and I'm exploring this in a study with the Asian Development Bank, exploring constellations of income standards, no longer income. They can be health, education, and seeing how growth occurs in other dimensions and comparing it to growth in income. But then distribution-related growth in income, likewise, as in the paper that I was just talking about, can be linked. And so these constellations of different growths is what we're really interested in if we want to talk about inclusive or broad-based growth. It's broad-based across dimension, but broad-based in terms of within a particular dimension and how the distribution of that is across people. Yes?
So these are measures of inequality over time, presumably
Yes.
with cross-sectional data?
Yes, this is cross-section. I'm not doing any not anonymous case.
Data you would have to worry about.
If I knew more, then I would certainly use it, because now we're in the multidimensional world. Once you have panel, it's 2 dimensions for each person. In my chronic poverty stuff, I used the multidimensional of chronic poverty to create a chronic poverty measure. It turned out to be a multidimensional measure as well.
I want you to comment on regression.
I can. Comment on regressions to the mean. Okay. Yes. Well, I've got one for you. Comment on Katie and her former husband, or soon-to-be former husband.
Oh my God.
Yeah, right. Katie, comment on Katie. No, it's not irrelevant, but it just kind of came out of, I mean, the comment? What the heck? Tell me what you'd like, and I'll be happy to comment.
Jay, you've got some old fogies like me. Who's Katie?
Oh, Katie Holmes, man! Tall, Tom Cruise.
I'm sure you meant Katy Perry and Russell Brand.
Oh, very good, yes. Oh, he is modern. Oh, yes, lucky jeans, baby. Okay, good, thank you. Would you care to elaborate? Would you care to elaborate on your?
I was just wondering, like, comparing distribution over time and measuring based on the same population, and worry about measurement error and regression to the mean in the second distribution.
Yes, if you merge, if you're taking what the average of the two, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, agreed. I mean, you will get less inequality if you have multiple observations that are then added or merged together in some coherent way. Sometimes, maybe not. It depends what the structure is of mobility. Yes?
Just to follow up, I mean, the conventional measure of regression to mean is actually that correlation coefficient,
Yeah.
rho minus 1. Think about subtracting the initial income, the parent's income on both sides, then you have exchange, which you regress against the parent's income. So that's, at least for economists, is the conventional.
The normalized variance, yeah. Yep. So that's.
See, I keep coming back to the same point, though. I mean, there's this huge literature on panel data, auto regressions that would get exactly to the question of regression to the mean. You know, like Browning's paper that was in the Review of Economic Studies, Martin Browning, 2010. Earnings processes with lots and lots of heterogeneity, and you can see like the distribution of the autocorrelation coefficients and so forth. So that's why it just seems, when you're treating it as something from outer space, it just seems like it's.
So are you saying we should use?
Inner space.
Right. No. So if the objective is to look at the permanent income or the average income over time, I would say.
Actually, you could look at the dynamics. I mean, you did literally the dynamics of the distribution.
Yes.
Who moves from what quantile over what time,
Mm-hmm.
and then you even construct counterfactuals off of it. That's why I'm surprised you're treating it as like the frontier. I gotta consider it. I mean, Milton Friedman was doing this in 1945. So.
Yeah, that's true. And lots of people have been doing mobility studies for a long time.
Yeah, right, exactly. So that's why I'm not sure why you're putting them up in the
I guess it's taste, huh?
No, but somehow it doesn't fit in the scheme. That's why I'm actually really asking. What is it about it that's so alien, I guess? What is it about it that's not quite suited? And maybe it's your, I don't know, maybe this is a personal question about your background.
No problem. I've spent the last few years working on poverty. I guess I have other issues as well.
No, I'm just wondering why. I mean, it just seems like it would be straightforward to adapt it.
Well, I'm looking forward to the case where you will make sure that I see it as straightforward and work in this area.
Well, I sent you 4 papers.
Yes, I know. You've just sent them to me. He expects me to have read them while I'm giving the talk.
I'll tell you what, I can start talking. You can listen.
No, I tell you what we'll do. We'll do that later, okay? We'll finish up this stuff and then move on. Yes, Steve.
James, can I give an analogy? I mean,
Okay.
Your talks are really about invariant measures, and what Jim wants to hear about are the transitional processes.
Right.
The stochastic process.
But they could be invariant. They could be ergodic distribution. There's nothing that prevents it from being stationary or ergodic.
No, the distinction I'm saying, let's give me whatever assumption you want. He's thinking about this is the invariant measure for the system.
Could
What
be,
you
yes.
want is the stochastic process,
All right.
which has different information in
And even going one step further,
it.
Which has more information. It's got the marginals and the.
Yeah.
well, yeah, you have more information because you have panel data. How many, outside the U.S., I guess?
Well, no, but even with cross sections,
Yeah.
repeated cross sections, you can do a lot of panel data analysis.
I know, yes, you can do pseudo panels, I agree.
You can still do dynamics even
Yep.
with repeated cross sections. That's why you're not stuck just with the marginal distribution. That's why, it's just a question, really. It's not, it's curiosity. I mean, it's
Yeah,
amazing.
curiosity, I guess it's just something I'm interested in, and that's as good as it gets, and I'm looking forward to the case where you can educate me as to how I can restrict the multidimensional nature of the data you're talking about, which is
Right.
a panel, a matrix, right? Taking that matrix and making sense of it in ways that are policy relevant. That's what you're asking, and the question is, what are the precise ways that we're going to get rid of information that we don't want to look at and keep information that we're interested in looking at? And that's, I would be happy to go there. What are the axioms that we need? What are the ways of looking at this, of refining the information? And I don't have that yet. And so I'm simply saying that I'm ignorant. I'm happy to say that.
So anyway, in your defense, the issue, another way that I want to think about what you're doing
Yeah.
is to give me this invariant measure, there's lots of stochastic processes that generate it. I don't find the dichotomy artificial. For example, think about a two-state Markov chain.
Yeah.
1 minus epsilon, 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 1 minus epsilon. It has the same invariant measure as epsilon, 1 minus epsilon, 1 minus epsilon, epsilon, even though in the second case, the graph is shifting back and forth.
Right.
It's very
Weird.
system, and the other one's highly scalable.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree that there's the,
So,
yeah. I won't let you talk. Okay, we'll go back and study. Okay. So let me explain growth for a second with this, all right? And so I'm going to talk about, again, the static change in inequality from this period to the next period, but it involves implicitly growth because of the way we're looking at inequality as this twin standard approach. Okay, so calculate the growth rate for one, calculate the growth rate for the other. One of them is usually the mean, as I said before, and you get down to the statement, growth of what is the key issue. So look at this graph and take a look at 1. That's the mean case. This is Costa Rica and Mexico over a 10-year period in that time period, okay? Roughly the 10 years. And of course, the growth rate, that's the percentage change in income standard over the time. The growth rate for the mean is about the same. So if you ignored the stuff to the left, ignored the stuff to the right, you'd say Costa Rica, Mexico during this time had the same growth rate. And the key here, of course, is to look beyond the mean to the upper ones to see Carlos Slim doing very well during this time in Mexico. Costa Rica, the rich are not doing quite as well, whereas in the other side, we see the poor are benefiting dramatically in Costa Rica. But in Mexico, there's even negative growth among the poor incomes. Of course, this was a very special time in history. I'm not using this to say anything about countries per se. I'm just pointing out that you have this very interesting graph that tells you a lot about the shape of growth in these two countries as a result of a function, of a graph that gives you the growth rates, one for each of the standards. Quite nice. You can do the same thing with the quantile. Okay, and that's a curve that has been used quite a lot in the World Bank. Yes?
What's on the x-axis?
The x-axis are the alpha for the general means that you're measuring growth rates in terms of. See the y-axis? That's mu alpha. The alpha is what's on the x-axis. I apologize, I don't have alpha written there.
And then we should be looking at the slope.
Not looking at slope. Yes, we should be looking at slope. That's true. Because if you had equal growth, that everyone was growing at the same rate, it would be a flat slope. If it tilts this way, then we have pro-poor growth. If it tilts this way, it's Carlos Slim growth. Okay? So this is quite helpful. You can see what you can immediately see out of this picture, what's happening in the two countries. And indeed, this was out of the paper, the growth paper that I had. Okay. Inequality of opportunity. Romer, of course, made the main point that it's more important, perhaps, to look at certain types of inequalities. Two ways of looking at it. We're going to focus on the inequalities across groups, where the groups are defined in ways that you would just not expect to see any differences in the means across the two groups if you had a just society. These are just circumstances that people are placed in. It's the education level of the parent. Two groups, high, low, and you say, come on, we really ought to have the same mean income. So the approach is in this paper by Chico Ferreira. Lots of different implementations are possible, but this is a simplest one. What you wind up doing is proxying the opportunities in each group by the mean. You could use the entire distribution and see if there's a stochastic dominance relation between them. And there's a recent paper that does that. But using just the mean, you get exactly the between group kind of inequality analysis. And Chico goes through the paper that I had with Schneiroff, in which we developed the class of path-independent measures, a particular form of decomposability that allows a lot more flexibility. And that gives you the tile measure, tile 2, the mean log deviation. He used that as the measure for the between group term. What is the smooth distribution again? It takes 1, 7, 4, 6, two groups, and smooths it to 4, 4, 5, 5. Within group gone, between group left. And it's that which is used, which is the basis of so many of these inequality of opportunity analyses that have been going on there. So there's another type of measure that's come across. I want to mention what that is because it's hitting the airwaves a lot more. And that's the Human Opportunity Index of the World Bank. And what it is, simply put, you can see it immediately. It's taking the inequality measure and reconstructing a size measure from it. So you take a mean, 1 minus the inequality of opportunity measure, which is smoothing out all the inequality within group. Okay, and then you're multiplying the mean times 1 minus that inequality. Well, there's smoothed out, so it's got less inequality than before, so you're discounting by less inequality to get the size measure, the income standard, which has this income standard over the smooth distribution. So you'll notice that when you use smoothed, of course, inequality is less, and hence the number is, well, that should be the other way around, I guess. Let me check that. Yeah, no, it's higher. S of x prime is higher than S of x because S of x includes all the inequality, not just the one that pertains to between the groups. So this is the way that they've been constructing Human Opportunity Index, and let me explain what they've been doing, looking at services. So you have a population, and does a population have access to services? They're focusing on kids typically, so kids services. And look what happens. You do, you don't, you do, you don't. 0 1s everywhere. Take your group of 0 1s. Your coverage rate is your mean. Right? The overall coverage rate is the overall mean. And they look at your coverage rate, your coverage rate, your coverage rate, replace your 0 1 with your coverage rate, and take a look at first the inequality, but also the overall average coverage rate, but now discounted for the fact that you have inequality. It's quite interesting. And that's the way that they're analyzing sort of inequality across groups, right? Salient groups. This group doesn't get it. The service is a heck of a lot. That does, and that is now measured as inequality. They're measuring this and therefore targeting the policies to address that question. Questions in the audience? Yes?
How do they decide what is a group?
Good question. So the main problem with the Romer approach is this. What are circumstances? What are things beyond the control of people? If they're kids, I'm sorry, I have a hard time seeing a heck of a lot of variables or things that are not circumstances, characteristics that are not circumstances. What's in the control of kids? Okay, so a lot of the critique of their approach is that they focus on a narrow set of circumstances, and then I say, well, why not all inequality if they're kids? They're not responsible for any of this stuff. And it's hard to reply to that. But nonetheless, they're saying, we want to look at this because it's an important first step in moving towards a discussion of equity. Because this is inequality of opportunity. These kids, they shouldn't be there. Yes, others shouldn't be there, but it's more of a second order. This is the first order. And a person in the bank explained this to me in political terms, and it really made sense, that they're approaching inequality in a kind of step-by-step approach with things that actually they have control over. Quite interesting. So I don't know if I answered your question, though. I went on and on.
Do you have an example of a characteristic that would define you as a subgroup and different groups?
Yes, for instance, is there a characteristic that's a circumstance, and the one hence would define the different types on the Romer scale, and one of them could be, of course, ethnic or racial background, the education of a parent, hence it starts fitting right into mobility. So it's quite relevant and closely linked to mobility issues, to be honest. Other questions?
All the variables that are at a higher level of aggregation, social factors, typically fall into lower circumstances.
So it's carried the day quite a lot in philosophy, but now it's been moving into actually on the ground work. So it's quite interesting.
James, is there any argument that if you get any demonstration that partial measures of circumstances somehow monotonically get you towards the Romer standard?
Gosh, so partial measures of circumstances.
Well,
so those
your argument is that we talk about circumstances, things people aren't responsible for. Obviously, we're not going to measure the values parents gave or influence them. The question I'm asking is any theoretical analysis that indicates that only conditioning on a subset will give me an interpretable measure?
Subset of?
The stuff I can observe.
Yeah. No, in fact, this is a great point, and my critique in my referee report of Chico's paper.
Turn the camera off and event somebody revealed.
Hi, Chico. Good to see you. You know I was your referee because I told you later. They call it the lower bound of inequality of opportunity. And so they're getting some estimate of it, but it's below what one would expect if you had all circumstances lumped in there. And so I said, well, that's wonderful to have a lower bound, but you don't know by how much it's lower. So that margin of lowered boundedness can vary, and therefore you can't really interpret what it truly means, right? That you're getting a lower bound and whether that lower bound makes a lot of sense in comparing over time or space. So that was my interpretation of what you were saying. I'm not sure I've answered you. You seem perplexed.
I was thinking about it differently, which is you have some outcomes with responsibility the non-responsibility factors. Somehow you ask what part can you predict using those, and that, at least in many of Romer's formulations, that becomes the thing you're responsible for.
Got it. That's your effort.
That way you run into very serious conceptual problems because you're defining your responsibility equating it with unobserved heterogeneity.
Yes. And that's the second approach to implementing this. It's one of them is a ex ante and one's ex post. So this is the description that people have said. But yeah, there are a lot of potential pitfalls of the approach and the implementations. I've mentioned one, that it's a lower bound. The other way of actually trying to model things and seeing what's going on in terms of effort and focusing on estimating who in this he takes the person in the quantile that is the same across the two distributions and says, well, they have the same effort. And so there are all kinds of assumptions that are made, counterfactual assumptions that are made to get to answers that could be challenged. But it's still a great approach and a great way to get a little closer to the kinds of things that opportunity might represent for a number of us. Have you seen it all linked to mobility, by the way? Because I've seen some discussion of the link back to mobility. Oh, have you? And could you also send me the papers? Yeah. Thanks a lot. All right.
Do you know any evidence that has worked this with, like, school, for example, as a measure of circumstances, and then
Yes, that's interesting.
Within school, like, for example, you can make like a ranking of the performance of the students,
yes,
and then that will measure like for within circumstances.
This is quite interesting, and I haven't thought of that at all deeply. The only thing that's related to it is kind of a discussion we had yesterday about tests and affirmative action and so on, where you have cutoffs, and you might have a public school cutoff and a private school cutoff. And I knew that in Sao Paulo, in Brazil, they actually have a cutoff for public school that's lower than the cutoff of the same national test for private school. And my question that I was curious about was, what do you think is the cause of this? And the natural response is, it's affirmative action. You know, the people in public schools are poorer and don't have the background. But no, it turned out that the discussion from the deans that I had spoken to at USP, at University of Sao Paulo, was, no, the people who come in with lower test scores from public schools are a hell of a lot smarter than the people with even higher test scores from private schools who have been schooled. So when you have that investment in human capital, well, is it perhaps investment in test taking and therefore not revealing, you know, the actual skill that a person could do on the job, in this case going to college? So it's a very, very interesting discussion, I think, of how you can transform, can look at the same policy from different points of view. Affirmative action, no, or efficiency. Fascinating. It's very different than our model before because we didn't have that aspect in the discussion yesterday. It was just, you literally were invested in human capital and therefore improved in the job that you would be assigned to.
I want to say that something like that is being implemented now in Chile, where it comes from.
Is that right?
Yes, and it's like kind of a more, I would say, like more pure change, because it's not that like there are different cutoffs or different schools, but they're including like the pure variable like ranking within schools.
Oh, I see. They're using the quantile itself, the
yes.
percentile itself. Interesting. Okay. Yeah, talk to me about that. That's interesting. I've been interested in various aspects of quality of education and other issues. So, all right. So poverty and inequality. I'm not going to focus on this here. I just wanted to have a brief mention and let you know that this is available. There's a whole lot of measures. Yes, you can set it up the same way with two income standards, one being the poverty line, the other being either a income standard or a gap standard. My FGT measures has a gap standard. So what? Just thought I'd let you know it can all be done the same way with twin income standards. Quite fascinating. Poverty lines across space and time. I wanted to mention this because it's a way that inequality is working its way into poverty analysis, or should. Back in 1995, there was, of course, this National Academy study, which is run by Bob Michael, Constance Citro, and they were asked to sort of figure out whether the poverty methodology in the US was any good and how it could be improved if it wasn't good in particular ways. So they gave lots of different suggestions, but one of them that was emphatically said at the end of the book, please, 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 please update the bloody line. Because it's been the same since 50 years ago, okay? Based on data that was even further back. So update the line was the statement, and of course it hasn't been done, but perhaps one of these days it will be. But in an AEA session that I was part of and ultimately appeared in the journal, we were all discussing the volume and some of the implications. And one of them that really struck me was, is there a way that we could effectively create a framework for changing poverty lines over time that made sense, or over space that made sense? Now, you know the poverty line in the US is constant, fixed, zero elasticity of that poverty line with respect to the income standard. You choose your standard. It doesn't change. Victor Fuchs, of course, had this wonderful proposal to do a relative poverty line. And it has been adopted in Europe entirely. I mean, they've taken it to the official statistics. And that would be something like half the median or 60% of the mean or something like that. It's a percentage of the mean of an income standard. But that seems a bit extreme. You know, the poverty line goes up by 1% when the standard goes up by 1%. Remember, it also goes down by 1% during the recent years when we've had bad economies. And that's indeed what's happened. And so everyone's been clamoring about, hey, the poverty's falling in Europe. No, of course not. It's not falling in Europe, but it's an artifice of the fact that the standard's fallen. So you get, once again, the double-edged sword. It looks good going up, but pretty bad going down. That's what's happening there. So is there something that could lessen that effect? Make it a little more sticky as a poverty line? And the answer that I provided was this poverty line called the hybrid poverty line. It's very interesting because you have an absolute cutoff and a relative cutoff, which have this Cobb-Douglas sort of form. The rho is a special number. It is the rate or the percentage increase in the poverty line as the standard increases. So it's by a percentage. So it's the elasticity of the poverty line with respect to the income standard. So it turns out to be quite a useful device, and it can configure across the world actually, because you have different countries of different standards. You can now think about poverty line configurations across the world, whereas the absolute approach of $1 a day makes no sense whatsoever for Europe or US, right? Or $2 a day, it doesn't. So this allows us to have a consistent framework for evaluating poverty and then answering the question I set out to answer in the paper in IER, which was how do the poor fare as growth occurs? Is growth good for the poor? You need a constellation of poverty lines that make sense across countries, not that are arbitrarily flat or change too much. So this elasticity, how do you get it? Well, one way might be to estimate it. Look at revealed preference, right? Countries change, in Latin America in particular, change their poverty lines pretty frequently. When they do, well, we could check to see how it is that fit that change in poverty lines as the income standards change, get the closest fit, and that could be something like, I don't know, 30-some-odd%, right? 0.3 something, which is what we got in Latin America. This is current work, so I don't know what we're going to ultimately find. Or it can be just selected arbitrarily and chosen, and you could use robustness on it. Or it could be seen as a normative decision, and this is really the exciting part of this approach. Because what you're saying to a person when you look at this elasticity, I say it should be 0.5. You're saying the poor should share in growth, right, in such a way that their standard should rise by 50% for every 100% that the income standard. So they should at least share that amount. Not too much, not too little. You get the idea. To what extent should the poor share in growth? Salient technology for implementing that, which is why it's I talked to someone in Brazil who said that goodness gracious, what's that? Who said that, that they've been implementing it in Brazil to now measure poverty now that absolute poverty has frittered away. They're now looking at this type of poverty as a way of incorporating the fact that more inequality is relative than ever before. Relative poverty is a different animal than absolute poverty, okay? So poverty has two components in this world: absolute, persons below the absolute poverty line; relative or hybrid, persons below the hybrid poverty line but above the absolute. And you would expect different policy prescriptions. There's essentially, I'm focusing on inequality among the poor. There are different levels of poverty, and that's very analogous to a bunch of studies that we've been undertaking on the ultra poor. The idea there is that you focus on one group and see how it's different than the other group of the poor, the remaining group of the poor. Quite an interesting question, and lots of people are interested.
Does the CPI figure, how does the CPI figure into this?
Okay, CPI is used to just basically update for price changes in the US. That's how it's done. You know, the poverty line does change in accordance with prices in the US. And maybe it does so a little much, who knows? We don't know. Whatever we talked about the biases with CPI and so on, substitution effect and so on.
It would seem like that would bring the consumption measure to this discussion of poverty line, right? Looking at the income distribution
Well, I think you did both of them by it, right? You did income and consumption by price indices. So it was used for both, actually, because the value of income matters on what you can buy with it, and so does the consumption you bought. The way you evaluate it matters on what the prices were.
So the elasticity is
Yes.
calculated for real income. The elasticity of the borrowed land to income is calculated with respect to real income.
Yes, it is. The question is whether it would be the same even if you didn't do real income. That's another question, because it is an elasticity, for goodness sake. Maybe it has both, on both sides. It won't have any units, so that's fine. Yep.
Some countries in Latin America define the poverty line using like bundles of
Yes.
goods that are,
Yes.
if there is a consensus that is the minimal requirement, what do you
Yes,
think
Columbia.
about that?
Well, of course, you have to do it some way or the other. The absolute poverty line has to be done some way. And that's typically done for an absolute poverty line. As I remember, yes, Columbia, there was a lot of argument as to which way it would be used, the World Bank approach or the Columbia approach. So I forget who won that argument, but yeah. Oh, goodness, isn't that interesting? But no, you have to start somewhere. But you want to know something? A poverty line, once calculated, does not remember how it was calculated. It's there now. And so deal with it, whether it was calculated in an intelligent way or not, who cares? It's an arbitrary cutoff. Get real, it's arbitrary. I could have chosen something lower or something higher, which brings us to questions of stochastic dominance, doesn't it? Because of the variation potential in a poverty line, you have to do some robustness analysis. By the way, Atkinson and Bourguignon have an approach that's different, and so does Revalian and Chen in a new paper in Restat. But I think that our approach is a little bit more interesting. Here's a great picture for you. Remember that formula? Yes. This formula generalizes the other formula. I don't want you to remember it. But you can calculate all those measures on this same line because they're just ratios of general means. The only thing is that you're taking, for this extended class, across the mean, you're taking pairs and drawing the segment instead of to the mean like we were for generalization. I just wanted to show that you can take this approach of income standards and create all kinds of interesting measures. Also, the Human Development Index has been altered in this fashion. As I was saying before, if you look at epsilon equals 0, then you have a mean of means of each of the distributions, say, of health, education, and living standards in the UNDP reports. That's the Human Development Index, or at least it was the old one. Unfortunately, they changed the formula when we recommended to do the IHDI. They wound up changing the original human development and making it a geometric mean. I didn't say to do that, but they did it, and I had no control over it, so what can I say? But what we were after was geometric mean of the entire distributions. So take the geometric mean of x, of y, of z, and then do the geometric mean overall. So it's one big old geometric mean over all the data. And that turns out to be what they use for the inequality-adjusted human development index. And it, of course, led to an interesting inequality measure, which is the geometric mean of that, right, related to the mean of that, or the original human development index. That ratio is an inequality indicator. Right? So you can use the mean, the original HDI, minus the geometric mean, IHDI, and put it over the HDI. An interesting multidimensional measure of inequality which arises from this. So summary, income standards provide this unifying framework for measuring inequality, poverty, well-being, and other concepts. I think there'll be a lot more work in this area. I plan to explore it a lot more thoroughly. At the empirical level, I really think there's some straightforward results that can come out, which are as follows. With these properties on that other standard, you're going to get inequality measures satisfying this sort of stuff. So all the axiomatic stuff can come out very straightforwardly. It'll be fun. Okay, let's go on. Questions. I'm going to stop for a second before I talk about one last topic. How much time do I have? Because I don't want to, bore people too much. 40 minutes? I'm sorry, guys. I'll just have to keep going. You said 50?
15.
Oh, how nice you are. Okay, thank you. Yes. Capability approach. Why multidimensional? I want to talk for a bit about measures that are multidimensional in origin. And probably the most interesting setting for this is poverty because, let's face it, measuring multidimensional well-being or inequality is tough. You've got to understand how this dimension relates to this dimension at all levels. It's almost impossible. To defend the Human Development Index is very hard because you have to say, when Martin Revalian critiques it and says, but the marginal rate of substitution at this level is this and it's not right. What can you say, right? So what we've done is look back one step, thought about multidimensional poverty, which has, a dimension such as sanitary facilities. How do you measure that with numbers? You don't. Or you assign an arbitrary number to it that reflects a kind of hierarchy, but maybe it's categorical, for goodness sake. As long as you have a cutoff, though, that could say that you're deprived for these and not deprived for those, then you're fine for the poverty approach. And we do this in each dimension. We have a cutoff, deprived, not deprived. So it starts looking very much like other systems of measurement. I use the similar sort of systems of measurement in looking at literacy and so forth. But that's the game that we're going to play in terms of ordinal data for measuring poverty in an environment where it's really hard to measure anything. Okay, so the goal here, I'll point out, is to measure poverty in cases where data are pretty bad. So why measuring multidimensional poverty? Why multidimensional? I think we all know that poverty is multidimensional. But really, it was the capability approach that allowed us to think beyond income or other single-dimensional ways of looking at poverty before. That was the way that things were done before. So Sen defined poverty as capability deprivation. Of course, he didn't set out measures. He didn't provide us with ways of doing things. And it's really hard to implement in practice. I'm sorry. If you've read that final chapter in the appendix, imagine trying to implement that stuff. Trying to write a paper that would be empirical using capability approach. I'm looking forward to reading yours. In addition to there being additional, there being a new way of conceptualizing this multidimensional world, there's now additional data on it. There's many more sources that give you health and education and some notion of living standards, though it usually is assets, in one data set. The tools are there because the unidimensional measures have been generalized to multidimensional measures, but lots of times not very carefully because the qualitative or ordinal aspect of this is not taken into account. And this is why multidimensional poverty, really. It's because there's a demand from governments and other institutions. They want to incorporate more dimensions. You might ask, what's the reason? I'll tell you a number of reasons. Carla Huff told me one very interesting reason, which was, I was sitting with her at a Nobel luncheon at the AEA in the audience listening to what was going on. And she said, well, what do you work on? I said, here's what I've been working on. Oh, yeah. So that makes sense. So the people who are in government can actually see some of the results of their policies before they're thrown out of office. Because with income, have you ever tried to affect income poverty in the short run? Won't happen. Unless you give transfers. Okay, and that's really sustainable, right? So she got it. That was the issue, and that's part of the reason why the governments are so interested, including your own president. I mean, I don't know. I didn't ask him. But I assume that he recognizes that policy can be implemented and that that implementation can then be seen in 4 years, right? And so that's the idea of this approach. So let's create a hypothetical. There's a government that wants to have some kind of multidimensional indicator, this time of poverty, okay? Because it's a little easier to conceive of, and we'll talk about the inequality stuff in just a second. It must be understandable and easy to describe. Guess what? Most people don't pay attention to this aspect of indices and measurement. Because if it isn't understandable and easy to describe, no policy significance, I'm sorry. They will not talk to you. I mean, they trust you for a while and then they'll go off. So this is important. Must conform to common sense notions of poverty, must fit the purpose for which it's being developed. So you have to come across with a purpose. In the case of poverty, usually is monitoring over time to see how the people are doing. The government wants to do that. Or it may be targeting. Or it could be, how do you create policies that might address this? Well, this has to be well suited in particular ways to do just that. It has to be technically solid, which I assume means it's published. It has to be operationally viable, which I assume means that you have data conceivably that you could use to implement it. And then it has to be replicable, which means that you expect data to be there to do it again Otherwise, comparisons won't be there, and you don't make a whole lot of sense by just publishing it once. What would you advise? That's the question that was put to you now in the audience. I'm going to relax for a second. That's good. Well, it really wasn't hypothetical because the Mexican government passed a law. I mean, there was a law that was passed in Congress that said you got to alter it from an income-based approach to a multidimensional approach. And here are the other dimensions. Sorry, these are the ones in law. Okay, so we looked at that and said, interesting. So let's see if we can put something together. We did, proposed a methodology. They announced the official methodology, which is a very close linked methodology to what we presented in the first place. In 2010, we in fact put it into the Human Development Report, and it's been going strong. The so-called multidimensional poverty index, based on DHS data on health, education, living standard, is now coming out regularly and is produced by my colleagues in Oxford at OPHI, at the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative. So I just want to give a quick indication of what that's all about and how you can combine these strange dimensions into one index, because it seems like it's magic, right? All right. Let me start with the typical income-based approach, because we use this approach in constructing the multidimensional approach. So single dimension, there's a poverty line. It's this paper at 84. Incomes are 7148. I want you to be able to calculate the head count ratio of that, and 5 is the poverty line. What's the head count ratio? It's the percentage of people with incomes below the poverty line. Clearly, we have 2 people, so I bet it's going to be a half. How do we denote that? Well, I'll write a deprivation vector, G0. G0 gives a 1 if a person's poor, 0 if you're not. Take the mean, and you have head count ratio. Now notice I'm taking means. I'm doing my standard stuff. Everything's an income standard, or some kind of standard. Normalized gap vector. Suppose you're interested in the depth of poverty. You might say, okay, poverty line minus the income over the poverty line. Percentage shortfall. Natural. Let's put that into a vector, G1, 0, 4/5, 1/5, 0. You see how you can calculate it? Right? Because 1/5, because it's 5 minus 4 over 5. Makes sense? Normalized gap vector, take the mean. That's the poverty gap, per capita poverty gap measure, which is used, again, very much by the World Bank. And this is usually done in the international arena, although it's been used domestically a few times. And finally, if you're interested in inequality among the poor, which is part of the reason we published the paper, is that it reflected potentially through a transfer principle inequality among the poor, we could square those gaps. Now, what does squaring the gap do? Look at the ratio 4 to 1 of the person who's very poor to the person who's not so poor. Well, you're going to change that to 16 to 1. You're heavily emphasizing the poorest to the poor in a squared gap measure. So this is the FGT measure. Take the mean of the squared gap vector to get the FGT squared gap vector, squared gap measure. And this is used virtually in every poverty paper that's put out by the World Bank and so on. Okay, so multidimensional poverty. Suppose you have many variables of dimension, and this can apply not just to poverty, not just to a particular approach to looking at the downtrodden. It could be for all kinds of approaches. It could be focusing on whether you're achieving something or not. It could be anything that could be potentially converted to 0, 1. This will have that framework. Suppose you have many dimensions or variables or dimensions. How do you evaluate poverty? Well, one way might be, first off, actually, why don't we aggregate all these things into one nice achievement vector? So we actually do have data on toilets and sanitation, and we have information on, say, jobs and quality of jobs, who knows, working in the formal or informal sector, right? That's one of the parts of the Colombian measure. Okay, and let's just aggregate all this stuff up. Now, how do you aggregate all that stuff up? It's apples and oranges. Okay, well, let's move back a second. Maybe they can't be aggregated, so let's restrict ourselves to a case where we can aggregate. Say they're the goods. Okay, different types of consumption expenditure, we're going to aggregate that up and it's just fine. If we can do that, then we can go to the single dimension approach. Forget about multi-dimension as a measurement device. Yes?
Kind of like PMP, kind of persons, it goes with the same kind of.
Yes, it's similar. It has it, but they're trying to look at income-based poverty through other data, right?
It goes back to the same line, though.
It does. In practice, it turns out to be similar. It's just the structure is slightly different and the purpose is, but we'll see, okay? I'll show you and you can compare it yourself at the end of the day because I'll explain everything to you. This is a case where you have many dimensions and you really don't care about how much of each anyone has. You could perhaps aggregate to a welfare aggregate or use price aggregation. These are all standard approaches to measuring poverty. There's problems with it because you need a lot of assumptions. You know, there may be ordinal or non-market variables out there and, you know, the usual types of problems you can have. Even if an aggregate exists, though, guess what? You may not want to use it. The idea is that the aggregate research approach signals what could be, whereas you might want to know what is. What are people consuming, or what are they achieving? One example of this is consumption poverty in India has been going down dramatically. Yet, what's been happening to malnourishment among kids? More or less constant. It's about 40-some-odd%. Something's going on here that isn't being captured in the consumption data as it's being configured. Maybe you want to pull out certain types of consumption, or maybe even focus on other things. So aggregating, as you well know, can hide policy-relevant information, and guess what? Once you aggregate and then cut, you don't get that data back. So let's say, suppose we have many variables or dimensions, but how do you evaluate poverty? And let's suppose they cannot be meaningfully aggregated together up front. So we're not going to put ourselves into the single dimension case. And it could be that we're not aggregating because it isn't going to give us a policy relevant outcome. We're interested in the disaggregated data and the deprivations within the disaggregated data. Well, obviously there's no method out there that would work, or there's not a method that could be used that has been accepted by a lot of people. So we have to come up with something new. That's what's going on here. Now, there's a lot of people who don't see why we have to go to some new methodology. I won't mention any names, but there have been a lot of people going back and forth in the blogs and everything else. And the fact is that you can't just limit yourself to a subset that can be aggregated because you miss out on so much of the good stuff. So that's the first thing. Don't put the blinders on and focus on things that you can, get data on. Focus on things that you can get really cruddy data on and try to include it within. Yeah?
So is aggregation problem a fact that you're measuring things at different units?
That's part of it. Yeah, that's part of it. Yes.
So like if you could create your ideal data set, like let's say for example, you had an input source and you had a policy you were doing, right? What kind of a data set would you assemble that would be aggregable?
See, I'm not entirely sure that you should be designing it to be aggregable. I'm not sure that's the best data for the policy question in consideration. It may be. If you're trying to get a welfare type of indicator or poverty viewed as shortfalls in welfare, then maybe that would be the approach, to try and put together a data set that would fill every nook and cranny of a person's welfare. But in fact, as Sen has argued very effectively, capabilities go beyond that. And we have to look at the source as opposed to the outcome through individual relationships between functionings and capabilities to individual well-being.
So we're not going to summarize multi-dimensional poverty Becker with like some scalar like a dot.
We will, but it's going to go like this. Look at deprivations, aggregate deprivations, not aggregate the original achievements. Because aggregating achievements is very tough. Deprivations, you can actually see how you might aggregate. And I'll show you that in a second. Yes?
I'm wondering, so yes, are you going to put some weight to it?
Yes, you will. And how is that done?
Yeah.
That's very interesting because the way that it's been done in practice in Colombia, there's a committee that put together the weights.
They just like said, okay, so
No, they actually do.
So like you roll the dice.
You don't hardly roll the dice. You certainly do realize it's a politically charged part of the exercise, just like setting cutoffs and setting what was called the poverty cutoff, as I'll show you in a second. But it's been done by committees primarily, but it can be done at the participatory level. I mean, we've done it with poor folks in villages.
And could you somehow elucidate stuff?
You can to an extent, but it's just hard to think how do you aggregate the preferences then? Because we're back to the social choice problem. So it really is a political animal at the end of the day, and it has to be chosen politically, and then once chosen politically, followed through with results politically. And I'll show you an example where that's being done right now. Okay. The second approach is just to use marginal methods, which means look at health separately as a distinct variable from everything else. Don't pay any attention to the fact that health impacts income, and then...
Can you just follow up this one remark about, say, it's a political question?
Yep.
So then, would your measure be a contingent on the nature of the political decision process?
Could be, yes.
So if I'm in China, as opposed to Mexico, as opposed to the United States, are these three different measures?
I would assume so, and that's what countries want, isn't it?
I don't know.
I would think countries would want that. Now, we do use a cross-country measure, which is chosen, I would say, more or less arbitrarily, to be honest, as most things like $1 a day or $2 a day were chosen, with all the discussion about it matched this poverty line or that poverty line. The fact is it's arbitrary at the end of the day. And there's a lot of arbitrariness in our measures, but at least we're not arbitrarily assigning zero weight to huge amounts of the distribution that's out there.
No, I'm just saying, well, look, if I thought if I had majority voting,
Yeah.
but not single issue majority voting,
Yes.
what would be the nature of the aggregate?
Woo!
Merge? I mean, just,
I've done work on multidimensional majority rule. It's tough. Yeah, so I can't predict.
right, so you're worried about avoiding cycles, arrow type cycles, and you're going to get voting cycles.
Yes, you can. That's why they usually dish it off to the committee and let the committee propose it, and it gets done.
Okay.
Yeah. And by the way, the fact is that this is methodology, and it's put in the hands of other people, and the people themselves choose what they want. That's what happens in countries up till now, and it's been happening in participatory groups. It's been happening in organizations of all sorts. So I'm just presenting the methodology that can be used and is flexible enough for people to at least understand that what is the the deprivation that's really important right now. What is the one that really is salient at this point and over the next 10-year horizon as we keep this measure over that 10-year to gauge what's going on, to analyze what's happening in terms of policy and how poverty is being affected by the policy.
The measure that would be salient would still depend on the political system.
I think it will, yes.
And then exactly how that group that's being misrepresented.
Of course it depends on the group.
Yeah, but I'm just curious.
Real politics.
It plays into it in these construction measures.
It plays its way into the construction, it turns out, of all the measures. You look at the $1 a day from the World Bank, $2 a day. It's there. It's all there. It's arbitrariness throughout. All kinds of arbitrariness. And we can talk to you about, I can talk to you about how the arbitrariness gets in there and how to do robustness analysis to see whether the rankings and all the discussions would hold up. They may not, as we saw with the recent reevaluation of PPP. And it led to incredible changes in the ranking across countries and poverties of countries. And so that can happen even in that case. So yeah, you're right, it's a problem to look out for. So the other approach is marginal methods. You could just look at each dimension separately and then not bring them together in a joint distribution at all. Yes?
Talking about the way to weight necessities, for example, in Colombia, some people use this methodology, this classic methodology of main components.
That's true.
And they use the results to
guide them.
implement policy.
Yeah.
What do you think?
No, they actually did use that in Colombia to an extent to check to see if they were too far from what they thought was reasonable. So they used many principal components. So you look at the weights on the principal component to see what might come out of what's really moving things, what's creating the variation. Very often they put something like income on one side, and so it starts looking like your approach to multidimensionality focusing on income. Okay, but I think it's reasonable to use any approach.
But in principal components also you have like rule of thumbs. Like
You have a...
like rule of thumbs, like things that are arbitrary. Like
Yes,
you cannot-
that's true. You have arbitrariness in each of the approaches. I'm just saying lay it out on the table, let other people see it so that they can try their own approach and see what happens under their approach. It becomes much more transparent. This approach is totally transparent at the end of the day. So identification is done through dual cutoffs, deprivation cutoffs, poverty cutoffs. Deprivation cutoffs in each dimension, poverty cutoff across dimensions. If you're deprived enough in the sense that you have enough dimensions in which you're deprived, then you're considered poor, not otherwise. There are weights attached to them, as we've been talking about, but I'm going to keep it in terms of a simple equal weighted just to present it. The papers are given here. concept, poverty has multiple dimensions. This mirrors identification approaches by many NGOs, depends on the joint distribution. It works for ordinal data. It works for converting qualitative data into quantitative results. It's pretty transparent. It's defined by variables, deprivation cutoffs, deprivation values, and poverty cutoffs. And it can be replicated and tested for robustness pretty easily. It can be implemented at many levels, and it's been done cross-country, within country, local village level evaluation. And currently in Colombia, it's a coordination tool for all the ministries in Colombia. It also is used for constructing other measures, and this is what I wanted to get to before I presented in very short order the measure. There are many ongoing country efforts. It's behind the Gross National Happiness Index in Bhutan, if you can believe it. The Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index that just came out through USAID and IFPRI and Oxford. Service performance, delivery performance measures by a student of mine. Corruption in the newest version of the World Bank Economic Report, whatever it is. And now could it possibly be used for non-cognitive skills? That's the question. I don't know. So here's the matrix of achievement. Okay, people, persons, rows, columns, dimensions. This example, income in dollars per day, say, first column. Second column, years of education. That's a terrible measure, but let's say we use years of education as education. Health, self-reported health, 1 through 5, just using the index. We're not going to use at all the cardinal properties of it, just the ordinal properties. And then access to a certain social, to a certain service that's provided or not. Okay, the cutoff is 13, 12, 3, 1. We have to determine cutoffs. Let's suppose that we say $13 a day is poverty in this particular country. 12 years of education. If you're below 12 years of education, you don't have a high school education, you're considered, deprived in that world. I said poor, by the way, poverty. I didn't mean it. I meant deprived in income. So both are deprivations. Third is if you're fair or poor health, you're considered deprived in health. And finally, if you don't have access to the social service, so you're 0, not 1, you're deprived in that dimension. There are the ones that we have deprivations with the lines underneath them. Okay, so let's convert that to a deprivation matrix, like we did before with the vector. Bingo, these are the people who are deprived, who's poor. One of the ways of seeing who's poor might be that person's poor in everything, deprived in everything, looks poor. That person's not deprived in anything, doesn't look poor. What about those other two people? And that's the question. So the way that this approach works is there's a K, which is saying somewhere an intermediate value in between the two extremes of requiring all or 1. And this K, let's say 2 for this example, would pick out persons 2 and 3. And person 2 and 3 has 2 and 4 deprivations. So I'm using equal weights here. Okay, so the approach can get the union approach or the intersection approach. Those are the two extremes where you require all or 1. Okay? This approach is, however, very nice because you get the intermediate approach where you don't get so many people who are poor or so few people who are poor. So it makes sense for practical implementation. This is the identification who's poor. Let's look at aggregation. One of the ways of aggregating, one of the first things you have to do is get rid of people who aren't poor. So that person at the bottom had 1 deprivation, but they're not considered poor. Goodbye. Then we look at the counts or the extent of deprivation among the people who are poor. Maybe we'll ignore that for the moment. We have 2 people who are poor out of 4. Is that a good measure? Well, let's suppose that deprivation went up for 1 person here. For that person, it wouldn't be reflected. So let's try and include the extent of deprivation among the poor in our measure, and the way we do it is through the adjusted headcount ratio, which is basically the mean of the deprivation matrix, as before when we had the mean of the deprivation vector. So it's a kind of natural analog, and here what we would get is add up the ones. You get 6 ones out of 16, so you get 3/8. Another way of seeing that is 3/4 is the average intensity among the poor, 2/4, 4/4, times 1/2, which is the proportion of people who are poor, once again 3/8 or 6/16. So this is the standard adjusted headcount ratio which is being used, the M0 that's being used. And guess what? If that person had an increase in the number of deprivations so that they were now deprived in income, they weren't before, you would see the measure go up, reflecting that additional deprivation. You could also generalize, as you would expect, to the entire class with arbitrary alpha powers like the FGT measures. It would be straightforward, but we're not going to do it here because we need data that are cardinally meaningful, and part of the issue is that we don't. Maybe if data become better, we can go to this level. Observations, it uses ordinal data. It's similar to HI, which is the poverty gap measure. HA is what it's called, head count times intensity. It's decomposable across people, but also across dimensions after identification. This is cool, because after identifying who's poor, you can actually say, well, the people who are poor in this dimension, or deprived in this dimension, but not really in that. So this is the one we need to focus on. It's the interesting, very interesting part of it, and one that we're now exploring in a paper. It extends easily to the case where deprivations have different values, and that idea of the values, it's a lot easier to just say, here's what this deprivation is worth, here's what this deprivation is worth, rather than doing all possible changes in the achievement variables. It turns out to be a lot easier to do that calibration. So here's the MPI, the example that's being done across countries in 109 countries this last year. Years of schooling, attendance, school attendance, each has equal weight within the education dimension. Child mortality and nutrition, each has equal weight within the health dimension, and then a variety of indicators in the living standard dimension. Notice it's echoing kind of the Human Development Index with the 3 dimensions and different sub-indicators within it.
Are there any family variables?
There are family variables in it. Implicitly, because I mean, there's actually some funny business, because some of the things are kids oriented, and what if you don't have kids, what do you do, right? But there's no explicit accommodation of, I mean, all the data are based on families, on households. That's where it's drawn from. So each person in the family gets, you know, their share of things. But school attendance is individual years of schooling. It's
So like, how would orphans show up in this index?
They would show up, how would they come? That's a really good question, and I'm not the empirical guy, so I'm not going to venture a response yet. But that's a great question. They would show up, though.
Yeah, the reason why I asked is because a deprivation may be, you know, you lost your parents because of it.
Absolutely.
Which is very common sense paragraph.
Yep.
Like, to the extent that you're not living with your biological parent. The kind of the shared resources that you get in the house maybe different.
Less.
You're living with an arm or something like that.
Oh, exactly. And I'm particularly interested in that question because my wife's grandmother was thrown in the well for that reason. She was living with relatives. They didn't want to take care of her, and she wound up in the well. So someone picked her out, and she lived with the missionaries after that. But it was, you know, that's exactly what happens.
And then in Haiti, there's a lot of interesting work with the Clinton Foundation is doing it for suggest so like people, basically like childhood slavery, where people would send their kids from the countryside to the city, and they stayed with a family, but then these kids are seen as like
Pariahs.
domestic, they are not allowed to go to school or anything like that. And so like not having a parent or some kind of figure that is like it's
killer. So then the question is, this is a capability issue, because for kids, it's all external capabilities. It's the capability of the people you're with and their willingness to let you access those capabilities. Yes?
I have a more general question
Yes.
about the decision of what categories to include in the rating given to
Yes.
them, and its relationship to the goals, rather
Yes.
what kind of policy and state you're trying to reach. And so
For this example.
Yeah, and so I'm more familiar with the U.S. example, so the poverty line is an absolute line based on income, and it decides, for example, Medicaid, Medicare eligibility, whether or not you get food stamps, and so.
And therefore, it's not been changed for a long time because it's linked to these policy
Yeah,
variables.
so should the inclusion, if you weren't aiming for a multidimensional poverty index, should your inclusion of these different metrics like involve thinking about, you know, what programs am I trying to?
It should. It should.
Okay.
At this point, this is multidimensional across countries, and so it was meant to, you know, have a reasonable comparison to show actually that it could be done across countries. Not that it's the right way, but that it's a way, because up till now it hasn't been done and people thought it couldn't be done. But by the way, when you start linking policies to things like this, you have to be really careful, and I think that's been part of the issue with multidimensional measures. How do the incentives presented, if they're used for targeting, react with you know, the measure itself. So this is, there was a visiting fellow who's been looking at this question in George Washington. So it's a really interesting question, and I think it's really hard trying to figure out all the incentives. Now, I don't want to keep everyone, we're waiting for lunch. I'm hungry myself. How long can I speak? I got to get out of this. I got to finish. Let me just finish my thought. Huh? Oh, okay, great. So,
In principle, 12 minutes.
12 minutes is just enough. Thank you. So,
But you must have given some thought. I mean, there's just a.
Actually, I meant 9 minutes.
well, now it's going to be 0 minutes, I can tell.
No, not 0 minutes. But you must have given some thought to the idea. You have these multidimensional.
Yes.
So if you really want to think about, you know, I think about the capabilities approach.
Yes.
I think of it as a frontier, right?
Yeah,
So, now the question, there's a non-trivial issue about aggregating frontiers, but you could nonetheless talk about individuals who are strictly contained within one set and another. I mean, so it's a partial order, completely agree. It's not going to give you this kind of, but it would be potentially quite interesting, like, to think about sort of what this bundle is, you know, this whole vector. You could order the vectors on each individual and think about it.
That is measuring capabilities and measuring opportunities. This is there's a paper in the Handbook of Social Choice and Welfare I wrote that talks a little bit about that. It isn't quite as explicit, but it's close to it. Yep. So that would be a possibility.
Why not pursue that route?
You can look at the dominance-based or an ordering approach. The reason we went into the measurement is I felt we had to first have an example of the measure before you look at some kind of a dominance approach, because other people had gone the other way with dominance approaches. Jean-Yves Duclos, of course, Atkinson and Bourguignon have done similar things with multidimensional stochastic dominance. It's highly incomplete, number one, but number two, it begged the question, wait a minute, I want an example of a measure that you're showing me that I can, you know, say something about.
Well, no, but wait a minute. I mean, just think about it. So it's incomplete. Think of it if you isolated a group of individuals who were strictly dominant.
Yes.
Like there's one group that's kind of at the bottom of the barrel, literally.
Yep. And that's stochastic dominance, let's say, of some kind.
Exactly.
Yep.
So that would be highly informative.
It is. For inequality as
well. When there's
well.
overlap, then that's also informative.
Yep.
Saying, well, you know, there's dimensions and maybe you might weight them. So I'm just wondering where, maybe you can post some examples so we can see where it's been tried and why.
Sure, I'll look up that, okay? Yeah, let me someone has to remember it though, because I have, you know.
Well, we can the handbook chapter that you mentioned.
Absolutely, I've talked about that there. That's right.
So I think Son and Stechel and Nutter also have those
That's
nice
right.
pictures.
They do have those nice pictures. I forgot the Cornell group. Thank you, thank you.
Which group? I'm sorry.
Oh, so David Son and Stechel and Younger have done the stochastic dominance with multidimensional stuff, but it gets really hard to look at visually beyond two factors. Like it gets really
That's right. So you get beyond two factors, and the idea of it escapes.
No, the visualization would be difficult, but you could imagine algorithms where you can isolate chunks of people, quote, strictly dominant.
Yeah.
Right? So
Yeah,
at least
exactly.
get some idea of how many of these groups, what the size.
And indeed, let's suppose that you had two groups that were salient, that were really important, and then you found stochastic dominance between the two groups in the multidimensional world. That would be an issue of inequality.
And then to see how economic development did or did not isolate these groups or bring them into the system.
It's interesting. Yes, I agree with you, and it's being done. This approach is, okay, you'll do that, right? Thank you. Yeah. So identification is done here through 30%. Aggregation is H times A. And here's a picture of the results, just to give you an idea of what's coming out every year now through the Human Development Index. I won't go into it. National methodologies, there's lots of stuff going on. Many more countries on board. I'll just mention these are the slides from the Mexican government and showing what they use. They have, I know it's all fancy stuff. I don't know how to do it. Just, okay, so here they have actually two types of poverty, and one is if you're deprived in even one social and income, then you're considered, come back. Then you're considered to be multidimensionally poor. And this is the one that, this is their poverty measure, period. Everything in the country is based on this. And they do focus on extreme poverty, just to have a look. This is the social rights space, the income space. They have a nice way of thinking about it and so on. Indigenous population versus the rest of the population, you get, it's just very, very interesting. And this was the thing that was fascinating for me in talking to the person who runs Coneval, the measurement agency. He said, this really saved his, over the last recession, over the last problems they've been having in Mexico, you can imagine the governors saying, whoa, what's happening with us? You know, it looks like things are going, but wait a minute, we've brought down these deprivations. All these deprivations have come down. This has been a big impact on poor people's lives. Yes, indeed, we've had problems here and here. This needs to be improved in terms of policy. This is hard to be improved because, you know, it's income. We know the big country up above us is causing a lot of the problems. So it turned out it became a very straightforward political discussion that you're actually doing work, it's showing, and you're getting credit for it. So the governor's got credit for it. There's been very interesting response to this. It's no longer called multidimensional poverty, it's just called poverty in Mexico. Colombia, the main thing I want to show about Colombia is, well, here's the dimensions officially chosen with the weights attached. The main policy issues were overcrowding in housing. They're very worried about this, and quality of jobs. So that was included. Now, I won't go into the details, but I wanted to show this lovely picture, which is off the website of the government. This group meets every once in a while. I don't know, it's every month, every 2 months, but it's the president right there, then all the different ministers. And they coordinate the policy, the poverty policy in Colombia based on how they're doing in these various dimensions. They collect data, they have programs to attack each one of these dimensions to get things done. When I saw this, this is amazing because it's a coordinating mechanism, a way of coordinating the efforts of distinct silos in the government to achieve a common end, which is at the end of 4 years to lower poverty by a stated amount. Of course, the president in Colombia is a PhD in economics from the LSE. So he may have thought this would be a good way of organizing a group of people. Finally, example, this very interesting Women's Empowerment and Agriculture Index. The main thing I want to show you is not necessarily the whole approach, but one index within it, which I'm exploring right now. Okay, so this was done by, the measurement side was done by Sabina Alkar and myself, as was the poverty measurement. This whole approach was to get a measure of empowerment of women so as to encourage greater empowerment, thereby producing more by women and more food overall. And this was, these are the discussions. 5 domains of empowerment index is an aggregate index. They've gone out and collected data on empowerment by different genders. They have women asking women, men asking men, and they get aggregate levels in countries, but they also have this very interesting gender parity index. And this is the thing that we've created. It goes like this. Take a poverty index, the gap. Use as the poverty line the achievement of the male in this household. It could be female because you get male gender parity index. But let's do the female gender parity index. Male level in household, women's level in household. If it's higher, no deprivation, right? If it's lower, deprivation, how much is there deprivation? It's how far on average you are as a percentage of your spouse. Average that up across all people to get the gender parity index. In fact, it's the gender parity index, so we want to keep it as positive, so it's 1 minus what I just told you. So that means you have more parity, less disparity, right? That's a good thing. Yes?
So how do you treat female-headed households? Because they
Yes.
do behave differently.
Well, they are, in fact, shown differently in the data, but they are just asked the same questions and so on.
I see.
And so some countries actually have very low disparity, very high parity, and some countries don't. This is the point of it was to, and it was piloted in 3 countries. Here's the women's empowerment. It's the same structure as the MPI, except it's going to be 1 minus it, okay? And you have the input and productive decisions, autonomy and production. These are direct questions in the privacy of their own home. All the way down to workload, leisure time. These are badly measured, sorry about that, it's just the way it is. Why would you ask someone about what they did yesterday to get an indicator of their time over the last year? It hardly makes sense, it's very unequal, it leads to strange things. Okay, but anyway, women has achieved an adequacy of 80% or more of the weighted indicators is empowered, and here are the 2 indices. I wanted to mention the interpretation of this one. There are parallel interpretations, but this one is the percentage of people who achieve parity, women who achieve parity with husband, time plus the percentage who don't, right, times the actual achievements that they do have. So it has a nice positive interpretation, and this is being implemented and rolled out by the bank and a few other places now. So again, it's based on a bunch of different disparate questions. You look at the negative of them. Do you not achieve it? Becomes a 0, 1, and therefore aggregated, and that's what we've been able to do. Goodbye. Goodbye. Okay. So summary. Blah, 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 blah. Here's what it is. And then there were other topics that I wanted to talk about, but we'll have to share them in individual discussion. Now, I'll just put one plug in. The issue of inequality with ordinal data or qualitative data is a big one. How do we address that issue? Because you don't have natural distances to talk about how far people are apart. So in a paper in the Journal of Health Economics, I proposed a measure that was median-based, that if you have the same median and then a first-order dominant move outward, that meant more inequality. And we did this with US data and found some very neat results and so on. It turns out that it could be used, and in fact, Angus Deaton had suggested 15 years back that I apply this to happiness data. And so only now have I gotten around to doing it, using the same idea. In fact, you might imagine median is the same. Yes, for most groups, self-reported health, median is the same across pretty much all the groups of interest. It's amazing. And the same for happiness over time in the US. Again, the moving outwards, the spread, you don't need to have the mean calculated, which doesn't make sense in the context of ordinal data. And so actually, Martina has generalized this to go on to more stuff. So ask her about what she's done in the Journal of Health Economics going on, and also other work she's involved with in multidimensional inequality, okay? And there were some other people who were working on that same question, the idea of a spread with ordinal variables. So it's an idea that I think is quite interesting. I'm going to stop right there, and I think I have a, thank you.